session, you can ask directly, and you may use the chat session if you have problems with the connection or with the microphone or anything, any technical difficulties that you may have. Okay, so I'm opening the first question. Okay, so I'm waiting. Okay, so we have the question from okay, from France. France, you're not in Indonesia, so how your connection is unstable? Well, actually, he usually have this kind of problem if he stays in Indonesia, but at the moment he's not in Indonesia and he still has the same problem. Okay, so Franz asking to probably to whom? Okay, to Kevin. How is the position of punk and DIY practice under the subjective expression of identity, class, race, or in the colonial-decolonial contestation? And how does its connection protest, network, and create differentiation, solidarity, and racialization movement in many places such as Indonesia, China, Aussie, US, Myanmar, etc.? Okay, please. Okay, probably this one goes to Kevin, but I think everyone can have their opinions on this.
I really want to hear Jim talk about this, right? Because I think that this actually goes directly to what he's talking about in terms of decentering, decolonizing the global punk and making connections around the Anglo-American centers, right? I think that's where important work is. So I'd love Jim to actually, if you want to jump in on that, not to put you on the spot, Jim.
Okay. No pressure, eh? Thanks, Franz. Good to see you here, and thanks, Kevin, for passing the baton. I mean, the thing that strikes my mind, I made a historical comparison in the presentation, but another sort of not particularly radical, maybe it was, is comparison for this decolonial approach is the non-aligned movement within the United Nations during the middle of the 20th century. So you had two big power blocks of capitalist USA and its satellite states like the UK and Europe and whatever else, and Soviet Russia and its spheres of influence. But apart from those two, and actually I think it was the majority of nation states in the UN were part of the non-aligned movement. Huge numbers of countries in Africa, Latin America, including Cuba, and across Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. Sukarno was one of the major players in that, and they had an early conference in Bandung. I've forgotten the year, but 1950 something. I'm sure someone can fill that one in for me. And that was an important movement. Not, as I say, not particularly radical in terms of its politics, certainly not anarchist. These are nation states, but they're organizing directly with one another across the margins of global culture at that time, split between communist states and capitalist states. And they're doing so to present a different way of thinking about the world. And I think, there we go, 1955. Thanks, Herman. So I think with this idea of trying to decenter punk is a similar job. Hopefully we can be more radical than just nation states, but it's about making direct connections between places that aren't at the centers, the cores of globalized capitalist culture, and how that makes people think differently. Kevin, you mentioned there about the inequities in terms of access to resources, and you're absolutely right. So I don't know, maybe that changes our job as researchers. Maybe, I've gone off and got some research funding. I can use that money to facilitate direct connections between these places. Whereas normally, as you suggest, the connections might have been made via the existing global centres, whether somebody had travelled to the UK or the US or Australia and brought stuff back, or bands from those places had toured in places like Indonesia or countries in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever. So I guess it's a way of thinking, how can we act as allies and accomplices in this process of decolonization? What have we got as researchers? Even though we're in the West, can we take our resources and put them towards making direct communications between these places? And what happens when we do that? So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of decolonizing. Just take the centers out of it, decenter it, and I think that's a kind of an anarchist sensibility. It makes sense to me, and I think it makes sense to a lot of punks as well.
Jim, I would Max Woods about neoliberalism, the ways in which the kind of margins, if you will, can talk to each other is now we're able to do that in the 21st century because of neoliberal capitalist technologies that have developed, right? So we can have that connection that we didn't have in the 1980s. So your earlier points about how DIY punk fits into kind of this neoliberalism in really nuanced ways, not just complicit, but also on the coattails, I think is directly relevant to that question as well.
Yeah, and as I suggested, it's not necessarily a new process. Those anarchists who were talking between New York and Paris and China and Indonesia in the late 1800s were doing so with the sub-oceanic cable, the telegraph wire that had been laid by capitalists. So it's not it makes me feel a bit uneasy, and I think it should make you feel uneasy. I think if you're overly comfortable with that, then you're not critiquing it properly. But yeah, I think when people hear that, Max Wood's thing about punk being a culture of globalized neoliberalism, it sounds like a completely defeating critique. Oh, well, if punk is reliant on neoliberalism, then how can it possibly be radical and so on? But if we look at historical examples, that has always been the case. So it's not a fatal starting point to come from. And then, as you suggest, Kevin, the interesting thing is how we work against that or within it, because this empire idea, we can't get outside it, we can't evade it completely. So what are we going to do when we're stuck inside it?
All right. Is there anything wants to add a comment, probably from Kevin, to follow the next question from Franz about how the connection protest network create differentiation or something, or anyone else from the keynote speakers that, okay, so because we are punks, then everyone has the same space to answer the questions, I think.
I do see in the chat that Indra has asked a question about the Myanmar anarchist punks having resilience in their resistance under the military oppressive nature, right? And so if people actually don't know Indra's work there, in terms of the evolution of punk in Indonesia, especially the rise of kind of Islamist stuff, he's doing great work, fantastic stuff. And so there's an interesting connection, right? So in the post-democratization in Myanmar, which really wasn't democratization, right? It was just military rule with a civilian veneer. But what I thought was interesting with Rebel Riot is they talk about a little bit of going inward in terms of thinking about their politics and making those local connections. And so putting their anarchist sensibility less in terms of fighting for democratization as they were after the Saffron Revolution, but making those connections with sex workers, with garment workers, with the poor in IDP camps. And it was those local connections that they developed, building those communities that Elise was talking about, with this anarchist sensibility, so that when the February 2021, coup happened, they already had an infrastructure in place. They had an infrastructure in place that they could really utilize for organizing. And so in many ways, it kind of, the coup breathed new life for what they were doing, but they already had the structure in place. They were already doing that work. It's just their focus now shifted in terms of resisting the military regime. And that kind of pressure, I don't think happened, post Suharto. So I think it's a very different development of anarchist punk communities in Indonesia and Myanmar because of the context there.
Can I ask a question to Will? Okay,
Well, yes, of course.
yes. Okay. Will, I was wondering if in your your exploration of hip hop in Indonesia, if you found, for example, the group that you were talking about that have like these politics against the Sultan in Jogja, if they've ever had any repercussions from their political stance, or any of the other groups, I guess, that were under study, have there been any repercussions, and to the sense of, has their music and performance have actually manifested as a threat in any way politically? And then secondly to that tangent, and obviously I'm going to ask this, but like, are there any women in the hip hop scene in Indonesia? And if so, what role do they play? And obviously just drawing on that anecdote that you said about the men in that hip hop group policing the way that women dress. So like, is there misogyny in the hip hop scene? And does that, also impact the way that women participate, or like cause a barrier to participation in that gender dynamic?
Okay, take the list. This one, have they ever received any repercussions for their political stance? Yes. So in total, in my whole thesis, I wrote basically on 4 different groups and hip hop collectives, and I guess the one that received, well, 2 of them. The first one is Jogja Hip Hop Foundation, and the second one is members of the now postmortem homicide. So people like Uchok that I know you talk to, and other members of the group and part of the collectives, and also people who are not involved in that space. For instance, I talked to a rapper in Tanjung Priok, who was recently beaten up by police intelligence because they were conducting illegal gigs all around the port of Tanjung Priok. And for the political repercussion that might seem a bit more clear would be the example of the Jogja Hip Hop Foundation. After they released that song, Jogja Ora Didol, or Jogja is not for sale, members of Jogja Hip Hop Foundation told me that there were pretty clear distinctions of how they were able to get connected with the Sultanate and the Sultan. So prior to that, when they released Jogja Istimewa, right, Jogja Special, they received so much attention and so much facilities from the Sultan and the Sultanate. But straight after they released that song, almost all of the connections just got cut off. So the sultanate were not really capable or not really explicit in the way they cut off that connection, but you can see how they treat them, how they give this oh, if you're not with me then you're against me kind of stance. And this also prevalent in quite a lot of other hip hop acts and other hip hop scene as well, so not just specific to those two. The second question is women in hip hop. Yes, they're I guess this one of the key point of my research that I found as well is that there is an extremely significant lack of female in the scene because of various reasons. So first one is that the blatant misogyny in some of some members of hip hop communities, or like some segmented communities in hip hop, is just ridiculous. Some people, for instance, Yako, who's one of the most famous female rapper in Indonesia, right? She told me when I interviewed her that she was basically groped during the mosh pit session, and quite a lot of female rappers were forced to stop rapping by their parents, or when they got married or they wanted to get married to a family, the family of their husband, their potential husband, actually asked them to not rap anymore, or to not sing, or to not attend any hip hop session anymore. So that is one of the concern. But yes, there are some hip hop rappers, for instance, in Yogyakarta. You got a dangdut hip hop group called El Sista, who are two sisters who rap by using dangdut as the background music. So you can clearly see that there are people who are trying to make changes. That there are young people who are trying to break this ice, break this mold of, hey, now we can use hip hop as a tool to express this sort of protest, right? And I guess that answers your third question, which is, misogyny in hip hop. But yeah, it's extremely prevalent. My my fieldwork in Indonesia for like 3 to 4 years, I wasn't really able to encounter that many female rappers, because whenever I met them, that tend to always be the answer. They were afraid of being in the scene. They were afraid of attending the concerts because they're afraid of getting harassed and groped, and yeah, all this horrible stuff. I hope that answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. It's obviously unfortunate because it's a lot of the same answers that I got when I was doing field work across Java in the punk scenes, and the lack of women in those scenes as well, and personally experienced as well. But yeah.
Yep.
Well, yeah, and Ellis, it happens also in metal scene, so it happens everywhere. So that's quite a typical response that you will get when you do this field research in Indonesia about the existence of women in scenes. Then you will get relatively similar answers in every scenes, I think. And this is a huge homework for us. And yeah, we just can keep trying and trying. Okay, so anyone else wants to ask questions or open the discussion with anyone in here?
Yes, I want to ask some question.
Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to ask the question. My name is Nurul, or you can call me Nurul. And I want to ask for Alice and also Jim, as I know that Jim had the research on women in punk about in Betina Collective, and also Alice from some collective in Indonesia. So my question is about, do you know about some of the collective is also problematic because the perpetrators is also from itself. Sorry, can you hear my voice?
Yes,
Hello?
there was a brief interruption from someone else's microphone, but carry on. You were talking about the problem of perpetrators being in the scene.
Yes, the perpetrators is in the scene, and also some of them also defend the perpetrators, and this is some of the issue from us because when we talk about fighting sexism and also misogynist, they have to know that they have to solve the problem, but not with defend the perpetrators. And I want to ask about what do you think about this? Thank you.
Elise, do you want to go first?
Sure. That is a great question and I think a huge topic that would be difficult to maybe answer concisely here. But yeah, even like myself having experienced that in the punk scene, globally, but as well during my field work and having witnessed it in a lot of punk gigs, and even like myself and Fahran being together at a punk gig and then trying to call it out. And I remember getting a lot of shit from people in the punk scene telling me I wasn't allowed to call people out and that it made me a bad researcher because I was biased and I wasn't allowing people to get away with that. So it is absolutely a huge problem. And I think the pervading misogyny and normalization of that kind of behavior is part of the reason why there's not as many women or maybe non-binary people and people maybe of the queer community and people of maybe of more of different backgrounds who feel safe. And like that's, as you know, like if part of my research is asking people about how they feel in terms of the safety and inclusivity in grassroots spaces. It's also questions for the punk scene. Are these scenes, because they seem progressive and maybe leftist and open and yeah, we're all against the system and we're all in this together, and this whole rhetoric is great in theory, but in practice these scenes are extremely problematic and like they continue to be. And so this idea that like there is no misogyny and there's actually accountability is like really wrong, I guess. And yeah, I think there are gatekeepers, and because the majority of people are men who are able to, who have that position of power and who have status and who do gatekeep, a lot of the voices of women who are who experience sexual violence, who experience harm, are often shut out and drowned out, and that causes a lot of women to leave the scene, both as audience members, as fans, and as practitioners, like as band members. And that's like, I found that in my field work. I'm sure a lot of people have found that. It is the same as well in some leftist like activist scenes. I don't know what the, like, I'm not sure how you fix that. And I guess, yeah, like I think engaging in those accountability processes and things is a great idea. I don't know to what extent it actually works in practice in a place where like there hasn't yet been that step towards like a more like a shift towards that culture where people are actually taking accountability. Because when I was there, it was not that long ago, people were not taking accountability, and there was a lot of people that were leaving that scene who were great assets to it, who were basically shunned out. And so I think like romanticizing the punk scene, both in Indonesia and globally, is always something that like is a fault and is a flaw, and we shouldn't do that because they are not safe spaces, unfortunately, for a lot of people. So I don't know if that really answers the question. I think it's like shedding light on that issue is really important because it is extremely dangerous for people. And I don't know I don't know what we really do about it. I think like it is a responsibility of people who book tours or book shows, people who I guess run venues as well, to call it out, because when it happens to you and you bring it out, if no one else backs you up, then it loses all credibility. So I think like people involved in like music making, in like organizing tours, and actually like organizing the venues and everything have to be active voices in that, and having like a banner up that says like no sexism is nice, but doesn't actually create any action against sexism and sexual assault. So there needs to be a lot more of that, and the accountability and the responsibility is actually shared, I think, among a lot of people within the punk scene who like to stay silent. So Jim, I don't know if you have further thoughts on that.
Yeah, just kind of expand on the points you were making. Just quickly, Nurul, are you one of the singers in Dead Alley? You a singer in the band Dead Alley? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But just be a coincidence. Oh yes, you are. I recognized your voice from the Inisin Kami Juga documentary. Great band. It's interesting, actually. This isn't a problem that is limited to Indonesia or other countries that might have, there are certain scales of sexism in countries that international organizations use, and Indonesia usually comes. I was mute. It's not a limited problem to these other places. It's also a problem here in Northern Ireland. So we actually launched a group called the Riot Girl Collective BC. BC's for Belfast City, at the start of November, and we showed the Inisin Kami Juga documentary because I just thought it was so inspiring, and all the problems that people talked about from the Indonesian context happen in Belfast in Ireland too. And well, it seems like things have regressed here, because in the 1980s, 1990s, the anarchist punk scene here had a huge number of women on stage singing in very active roles in the various collectives. And then through the 2000s and 2010s and until now, that kind of has dissipated. It's quite uncommon to see a woman on stage now. And actually, it got so bad that the Riot Girl scene that did exist here in Belfast, that does exist here in Belfast, separated itself off completely from the DIY punk scene. They were two separate entities that didn't overlap because they just felt so uncomfortable in these macho punk spaces, even though they were anarchist punk spaces. So one of the accountability is exactly right. Elise is talking about all that. How do you do that? I mean, Elise, you talked about things like restorative justice and so on, and that's something that people have tried here with the post-conflict situation. And I'm not sure to what extent I agree with it. I mean, if I were to imagine, an anti-fascist kind of activism, if somebody came in and was being a complete fascist bonehead, would I want to engage in a process of restorative justice with them? No, probably not. If I were the victim of sexist abuse and assault, would I want to engage in a process for restorative justice with them? No, I'd rather see them kick the fuck out of the scene and not welcome back. Would that create a safe space, a safer space, arguably, but is it less inclusive because we're not reaching out? I don't know. It's a really difficult issue, and I'm certainly not going to tell other people what they can do. But the one thing I thought was really interesting, I spoke with Hera Mary, the director of the Inisin Kami Juga documentary, and I was talking about what are the wider impacts of this and how is it influencing other bits of society. And she just laughed at me and she said, I don't care about anything outside the inner circle. It's just about representing the girl gang and the women that are here. This idea that the documentary would have to impact wider society in some way and all the rest. She laughed at me. And I actually think it's really powerful. And maybe I guess that's what kind of Riot Girl is all about creating girl gang solidarity, creating a place that women and trans people and non-binary people can organize together. And then when they intervene in the wider punk scene, they do so from a position of collective strength instead of being isolated. So when you call somebody out for sexist bullshit, you've got the girl gang at your back and you're not alone. So I found that a really inspiring bit. I don't know if it helps, and in some situations you are on your own, and it's difficult. But yeah, I think collectivizing and organizing from positions of strength is what I found inspiring from talking to women in the punk scene in Indonesia.
Okay, Roel, what's about the, are you satisfied with the answers? Like actually we never find out up until today what is the real solution towards this kind of problem, because in Indonesia actually we have this, I don't know, seniority complex or something. So when the perpetrator is one of the senior guys in the scene, and then they will just, okay, so if we blew up the case and then it caused the steering controversy here and there, especially in social media. And but right after that, the climate will get chill and chill and chill and then just disappear naturally. And then we just have to wait about a couple of weeks or probably months, and then this perpetrator is returning to the scene and acts like nothing happened, and everyone's forget it, and they keep moving on, and probably in the future they still have the tendency to do the recurring this kind of harassment or something. So it happens as well. So this seniority stuff is kind of, I don't know, we are quite fed up about this. Okay, so the next question will be from the chairman of the PSN, Fahran, to all of the keynotes. The loss and isolation, lockdown, loss of freedom, loss of jobs, and loss of lives actually happen after the corona times is unforeseeable. I was just wondering, what do you think that we need a new conceptual reference to talk about what humanity, punk hip hop can still do in the face of precarious future? Okay, so this one is for all the keynote speakers. So who's going to answer first from the Fahran?
I don't mind jumping in if nobody else has anything immediately.
Okay, please, Jim.
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I guess it's the condition of crisis. And this crisis has been acute, but it's not the first condition of crisis that we've faced. And I think punk scenes usually respond really well to crisis. I mentioned earlier about the 1980s in the UK. We had all these structural readjustments. The IMF and the World Bank had given a big loan. So now it was time to change the UK economy to be a neoliberal economy. And that resulted in closures of industries, joblessness, a lot of hopelessness. It was a bleak decade. I was only born in 1986, so I didn't have to suffer too much of it. But I've seen the videos. But actually, it was a really exciting time for punk. You know, you had the prominence and then emergence of bands like Crass, anarchist punk critiques, all kinds of a hardening of DIY approaches, UK hardcore, UK 82. It was a kind of a brilliant decade because of the crisis situation. You might think the same 2008 financial crisis. After that, punk scenes here anyway seem to have an uplift. People seem to have more time and more thought about critical perspectives. The difference with this crisis is that we can't get together to express our collective rage in the same way. And I don't know if that is something fatal, but from my own anecdotal experience, I know of lots of friends of mine who have started new bands in the last 6 months or so. All the pent up creative energy, all the pent up anger, frustration of the last couple of years, they're really looking for a vent for it. That's great, but if we can't get out there and do it together, maybe that will kill that energy, or I don't know where else it might go. So we need to be able to get together and express that, and under the current situation, we can't. So crisis is a common reference for punk, but this crisis has a different flavor to it. So I don't know.
Yeah, I would add the power and potential of organizing is really great. Obviously, that's whatever is within people's capacity, and crisis can make it harder for people to be able to organize. But I think that opportunity, and again, like inspiring enough, like that idea of like gotong royong and people coming together, um, you know, a group works better than an individual. And I don't think this is something that like folks in Indonesia are new to. I think people have been doing this quite successfully. I think also not underestimating the power of upskilling, and like grassroots upskilling and being able to, everyone has talents, and if you can pass those on and like free skill sharing to others and then learn from other people as well, like knowing new skills and taking that in a situation of disempowerment, to be able to be more prepared for the next thing that's going to hit us, because unfortunately this crisis is part of a series of probably crises that we will see, and of course with the looming climate crisis and all the repercussions that will have, we need to be equipped and we need to have better skills, and upskilling in a grassroots way is a really great way to not only do community building but to be more prepared for things that will get thrown our way. And I think again, engaging in mutual aid, if we can't do direct action in a more like frontline way like some people with more privilege can do, in Australia and in North America and maybe some places in Europe, people can really weaponize that privilege and put their bodies on the line. But in other places you may not be able to. But participating in mutual aid and being able to give back when you can, or to be able to engage in those community building practices, I think is like really, really key in then having that network, which again will then serve in future situations of crisis. So organizing, upskilling, and like knowing your community and practicing like gotong royong in the most like tangible ways is actually a good like conceptual reference, again rooted in the vernacular, that I think is quite key, but that is not new to folks in Indonesia.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Those are two great responses. I mean, as Jim points out, right, punk tends to respond well to crises, but this is a particularly unique crisis because of the way it cuts straight to and challenges our ability to connect, right? Punk scenes depend on connectivity. And so there's been a huge challenge to that. But I think the resilience is there as well in terms of how people are now employing new technologies. Anecdotally, seeing bands record and practice over Zoom, and the way that they're releasing music and producing music and doing other forms of cultural production as well. The resilience is there. In North America, there's a lot of attention to the impact that the pandemic has been having on the music industry, all the way down to music venues, closing of music venues and so forth. But from a DIY punk perspective, that shit doesn't matter, right? Because we weren't reliant on those formal types of infrastructure. I mean, DIY punk in North America, a lot depends on like house shows and these kind of organized kind of pop-up venues and spaces. And so if venues are closing for the music industry, that means that there's more space, and maybe DIY punk can pick the bones pick over the bones of some of the things that are falling by the wayside there in terms of corporate music industry. But I do think it also draws attention to the fragility of scenes and the fragility of connections, and the fragility of individuals operating in these spaces, right? I mean, one of the things Elise talked about, right, was noting that scenes that rely on DIY, right, can be some of the most fragile, right? And what we're seeing here is the need for self-care and community care. And I don't know how it's going to play out because we're still in the middle of this, right? And the next wave, Omicron, is upon us. But I do have faith in the resilience of DIY punk and DIY punk communities.
Yeah, and
Okay. Okay, the final opinion from the team, from Will.
I think just adding a little bit, it might seem different because I'm not too familiar with Indonesian punk scene, but my observation throughout 2020 and 2021, in regards to Indonesian scene, especially during this pandemic, is that it grew even bigger, like the Indonesian hip hop scene itself, um, for unknown reason that I'm still trying to find out, they have been able to keep reintroducing ways and techniques of incorporating members of the community, even better than they were prior to the pandemic. And I guess it speaks to Alice's material as well. They were able to build these connections, these networks prior to the pandemic that they end up using as their foundation, to navigate through this truly challenging time. For instance, even though they weren't able to do, say, any offline practice or any offline gigs and shows, they were actually able to do, like, they were hosting shows on IG Live, they were hosting shows on YouTube Live or on Facebook, and they use these shows as a method of gathering money and donations, which they then donate back to their communities, and or to those organizers able to use their networks and connections to actually open up soup kitchen, or to open up like communal kitchen, or community fridge for people to access when they weren't able to provide anything. So yeah, it's just quite different observation, I guess. Thank you.
Well, okay. So actually, this is how punk's response to crisis in general. That probably since punk raised from crisis, then it has this certain positivity to back from the dead, I think. Okay. Next question is from Julius Fabriarco. It's especially directed to Ellis. You mentioned performance in your title. My question is, what kind of performance do you revert to? To what extent does this performance become the power of performative performed by the grassroots activist communities? Okay, please, Ellis.
This is good because it holds me accountable for putting random words in my title when I haven't fully thought through what my title is going to be. So good. Now I can answer this. I think what I wrote was, resistance beyond subcultural performance, and what I kind of was alluding to there is how I think in punk, or as I've experienced it, and what I found in my master's as well, was that subcultural performance of resistance, which is rooted in music as a performance, as aesthetics as well as a performance, and that being contrasted or juxtaposed with more tangible resistance in the form of direct action in grassroots activist communities. And direct action could be, literally putting your body on the line in terms of, blocking a coal train, the same way it can be mutual aid, and everything in between on that spectrum. And I don't want to negate the potential of subcultural performance as well in terms of resistance. I do think that there is powerful potential in aesthetics. I think there's powerful potential in music, but I think they just have perhaps, how do I say this? I see I hadn't rehearsed this. This is good, catching me off guard. Different outcomes, maybe different I'll get back to you on that. But anyways, but yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to try to answer that either. But I do also think, in that grassroots activist communities do also utilize performance and performance as resistance in the way that they use, theatrics and art and whatnot and music. And there's, again, huge overlap, especially in Indonesia and the Philippines, between art and activist scenes. and then like the tactics that they use in performing resistance can be actually quite similar. And, you know, punks can be activists, activists can be punk, and vice versa. I don't know if anyone wants to carry on that train wreck of an answer.
Right, Alice, thank you for your answers. I'm sorry, I cannot turn the camera on because it's cost me my quota more, my in quota more. So,
Oh, that's okay. But thank you for the question.
Yeah. Actually, it's I also did the research on the performance also, and what interesting is I found a similar thing with what you did with your militant methodology, if you say so. That everything that perform is has a potential to have such a performative power to change. I mean, at least disrupt the dominant culture, I think. So I think that's the similar thing that I found in what you did for your research. So keep doing it. So good work. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you for the question.
And also, and also I think I got a concept, an interesting concept from Richard Sennett. I think he's the father of performance theory or something. And I use it in my research. It's called the dark play. Play. So
yes.
To disrupt something that so dominant, like government or something like that. So I think it's good to match and to find a network in this, not just on the do-it-yourself grassroots activities, but in the punk scene, hip hop scene, metal scenes. Everything is about struggle, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely power to performance.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julianus. And right now, for the final question in this discussion, we'll go to Arif because he already raised hand a couple of minutes ago. And please, Arif, throw your questions.
You. Okay. Kudos to all the presenters. I have two simple questions. One is for Elise and one is for William. So Elise, your presentation reminded me of footnote bombs era in my city around 15 years ago in Semarang, the capital city of Central Java, Indonesia. I still remember some of Earth Crisis tracks being played there, but unfortunately, this movement right now has gone silent here. But as an outsider of the scene right now, it seems that this kind of movement steps back nowadays. It's quite it's quite sad because the pandemic momentum should emerge this movement again, but still no news about that. So how about in other countries or cities in Indonesia, if you know? So what makes this movement hides behind the curtain, especially in smaller cities? So if I may ask, but yeah, it may be because I'm an outsider of the scene, but the question is, isn't the purpose is to reach the wider audience in here? So second one is to William. So hi, Will, that was a very interesting presentation. So hats off to you. I'm sorry I didn't follow that much, but as far as I heard from you, most of the hip hop groups use local language or maybe national language to speak up their voices about many issues. So did you find any Indonesian groups using international languages to address this kind of issue? Well, thank you very much for the answers.
Thank you for those questions. I guess it's hard to answer without knowing specifically, in Semarang or in other cities, take a back seat, because it does seem, as you said, with the context of the pandemic and momentum around in food security projects and mutual aid, and that that very obvious distrust towards the government and that anger towards the government that there has been in most places a boom for that. So why have I've been muted. Oh, I'm unmuted. The only hypothesis I could offer is, I guess, like tied to that idea of burnout. Like, is it is there little support and then little personal resources and little financial resources available that make these kind of projects, even these small mutual aid projects, actually unsustainable? And with those added burdens of the pandemic, not only the financial pressures, but that huge emotional pressure, and then maybe added caretaking duties, added duties, what might be at home in the family, that people just don't have the time and resources available to actually give outwardly. And I'm sure that's maybe relatable on a broad spectrum of things, being so burnt out by the impacts of the pandemic that those mutual aid projects have actually had to be put on pause. So that's obviously quite unfortunate when they are actually maybe more necessary at this time. But yeah, I'm not sure if it has to do with people just being geographically not there, if it has to do with other things happening with repression from the government. I mean, obviously, like in places like the Philippines, the community pantry movement was red tagged. So the government was actually stepping in and labeling people as communists, giving them an excuse to actually to jail or to harass people. So I don't know if people have targets on their back when they do mutual aid stuff, or more like engage in more like leftist things, even in smaller places, if it leaves them more susceptible to harassment, to stigmatization, or to repression in some ways from authorities as well. But hard to know without knowing the specificities. But it's a really interesting observation, and even even just being an outsider, you'd think that these things would be taking more of a place. So if they're taking a back seat, why is that? And I think that's quite interesting in and of itself.
Hey, Mas, just to clarify again, so your question was, are there Indonesian rappers or groups who use Indonesian language to raise international issues? Was that the question?
Do you find any Indonesian groups using international languages such as English, for example, to
Ah.
address this issue?
Okay. Yep. Yes, there are plenty of them. Most of them are Jakartan rappers. So you got, for instance, the closest one would be the Ona Collective in Jakarta. You got quite a few of them from Bandung as well. Like even Homicide, when they released their 2002 album, on I think out of 5 or 6 songs in that that album, only 2 of them was in Indonesian, and the rest was in English. And that tends to be the trend, but it somewhat changes. So they from what I can observe, Indonesian rappers have started to embrace more this locality, trying to get more of this local touch on their songs and songwriting techniques. Whereas if you rap in English, the scene actually tend to look down on you, because there's this tendency of looking at people who rap in English as those who don't want to try hard enough to rap in Indonesian. That's the sentiment that I'm getting from the scene. But yes, there are quite a few of them. Hopefully that answer your question.
Okay, thank you, Will, for the answer. And Arif, hopefully both of them can fulfill your curiosity. Regarding the footnote bombs, we have the same story here in Bandung. Like I was there probably 15 or 17 years ago, and then it got disappeared along the way, but it reappears a couple of years ago, and then disappears again, and then right now appears again during the pandemic, but with the same spirit, but with a different name. So I think as long as we keep believing, then they will reincarnate themselves. Okay. Everyone, we have come to the first session. We have come to the end of the discussion or Q&A session. And to sum up, to be honest, I have nothing to say to sum up because I got a bit overloaded with information and stuffs. But I think as long as we keep believing in punks, that is all we can do right now, and let the better future show itself. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you PSN Indonesia. And I'm going to give it back to the MC while I'm preparing myself to watch the performance of my adolescent heroes, the Mike D, vocalist of Useless ID. Okay, thank you everyone, and see you next time.